Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to RYA training in the virtual classroom. I'm James Davies. I'm an instructor, trainer, and examiner working freelance for various centres worldwide and using my appointments with RYA training directly. I'm absolutely delighted to be presenting this to you this morning from the comfort of my study. I've got my dog asleep at my feet, I've got a cup of tea in hand, and I haven't had to travel anywhere in order to come and say hi to you all. At the same time, obviously quite disappointed that we're not getting the chance to meet and discuss the finer points of everything that we're going to go through at the conference today around a drink later on in the evening. We'll be doing it in spirit. So this session has been pre-recorded, and the reason for that is that I've got quite a lot of technical information that I want to go through and show you. So we put it together as a bit of a video. However, I am live with you in the Q&A section of the conference. So if you send a question through, I will be responding live while we go through watching my presentation together. So as you will all know, in March 2020, the world changed absolutely massively and the training landscape was altered really significantly for just about every industry. The RYA very quickly allowed us some temporary variations to the conditions of recognition, meaning that training could continue to take place wherever possible in whatever the safest way possible was. So one of those things that they allowed us to do was to begin delivering some of the shore-based courses in the virtual classroom, bringing people together in order to complete the training in a way that we hadn't really done before. This is obviously really quite exciting because it's one of our strengths as instructors that we've been able to adapt, that we've been able to improve what we offer, and you wouldn't be here today if you didn't want to make sure that everything that we do moving forwards is as good as it can be. So the scope of what it is that we're looking at going through in this presentation is a little bit of stuff about the virtual classroom versus the traditional or face-to-face classroom, and what the similarities are, what the differences are, and what the drawbacks are. One of the things that enables us to explore is the benefits of using the virtual classroom and some of the things that we get that we wouldn't necessarily get in a face-to-face or traditional setting. I'll try and go through some tips and tricks with you and show you some of the things that I've used over the last 10 months or so that have worked, and maybe even talk about some of the bits that haven't worked so well, and give you an idea of some of the further resources that are open to you. So this sort of setting that's appeared behind me will doubtless have become a familiar sight to many of you, both family gatherings, connecting with friends, and potentially meetings, delivering training yourselves, maybe even being a student on a training course. So not only is it a familiar sight, but the words, you're on mute, you need to turn your camera on, can you see what I'm sharing, you're still on mute, all of that sort of stuff has become a frequent part of our lives. And we find as deliverers that we have to, yet again, train ourselves in terms of how we adapt to this new environment, becoming almost like IT experts as well as boaters and navigation instructors or whatever type of instructor we are. So thinking a little bit about that and thinking about this Zoom environment with people on camera, with resources shared or presentations shared, whatever it is we're up to, it's really important to have a little bit of a look at some education and learning terminology and theory. We have a difference between what we call asynchronous teaching and synchronous teaching. So asynchronous teaching or asynchronous learning is anything where the learner can access it at any point and it's delivered to them. They can dip into it, dip out of it, spend all day on it, 10 minutes on it, do it at 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever they want to do, and they do it independently. It's on their own and it's sort of self-directed. So the online course deliverers will be really familiar with the concept of asynchronous learning, giving somebody a resource and letting them get on with it. Synchronous learning is right at the heart of what we've done in practical training and predominantly what we've done in shore-based training since the RYA training schemes were first developed. This involves a contract of learning between a school and a student, and then later on an instructor and a student. And it involves bringing multiple students together to learn at the same time, to learn guided by an instructor, supported by an instructor, maybe learn from each other, maybe using peer review and peer learning. So synchronous teaching is really what we're looking at in the virtual classroom. And it's really, really important to have that in the back of our mind. What we deliver in the virtual classroom needs to be something that has a point to it, that has a reason for bringing all of our students together to one place. So it needs to be more than just a video that we push play on or a series of slides with us just talking over the top, because we could wrap that up into a web tutorial or similar and just let them watch it. So that means that we've got to have all of that good stuff that we've been using in a face-to-face classroom, all of that interaction, engaging lessons, all of that peer learning, peer review, instructor support, looking over the shoulder, everything like that we've got to make sure we keep the focus on. So where's all this going? Well, all we know at the moment is that we're operating under the temporary adjustments to the RYA conditions of recognition and doing the best we can to work through a fairly challenging situation. So we're just going to have to see how it all evolves. We're going to have a look at some tips and tricks and things very, very soon, but I'd like you to just keep in the back of your mind 3 core concepts to delivering training in the virtual classroom. The first one is that we must remember to teach. The lines of what we use our software for have been sort of blurred and obscured in recent times with frequent sort of parties, get-togethers, meetings, online training, online tutorials. It's all sort of merged into one. And there are some really key differences in how we actually use the software to get our message across. So we must remember that teaching comes first. That's what we're there to do. We've also got to remember to interact. There's a point to bring all of our students together for synchronous learning. So we've got to use it. We've got to interact, engage with them, connect with them. They will love us for it if we make sure that we provide the insight and we are their boating and navigation expert after all. And then we've also really got to remember to enthuse them. We've got to remember to inspire them. It's important to be clear that boating is fun. That's at the heart of what we do. We're trying to make sure that our students leave us ready to go boating and enjoy themselves more, because what we've done is we've given them those fundamental principles to help. So any classroom is designed to prepare a student for reality, and we've got to make sure that we remember the real world while we're sat in our studies, trapped in our house, and not being allowed to go anywhere. So we're going to look at some of those concepts and some of those sort of tips and tricks and setups that I've used using some software called Zoom, which seems for a number of reasons to be the most popular and most accessible for virtual teaching. And then at the end, we'll pull them all together, have a little bit of a look at where things are. And then at the end, we'll pull them all together, have a little bit of a look at the concepts that only work in a face-to-face classroom that we've maybe lost through doing things online. Have a look at some of the things that we've gained by using an online environment for the virtual classroom, and then have a look at the many things that exist in a sort of crossover zone where we can both emulate them in the virtual classroom and we can also use them in a face-to-face classroom. So let's start with the first one. So the first one that we're going to have a little bit of a look at is the initial setup and entry into a meeting. So I've got a Zoom session set up, and the very first thing that the students are going to see is something called the waiting room. I don't get to see that as the instructor or as the host, but what we're going to do is have a look on 2 different screens of what it looks like for them. So here we are with a candidate viewing it on a desktop Windows computer, and there's some important features on it. It tells them that they're in the right place. I've got a little training centre logo up there, and I've reassured them that the meeting will begin promptly at the time that is allocated. On something like an iPhone or a smartphone in general, that will look very similar, but potentially slightly different, because it will be a little bit smaller. So here, all of the text is a little bit more bunched up and a little bit smaller, but again, it's quite reassuring because it's customized and it's fully set up in order to make sure that the student knows that they're in the right place. So this is a really scary bit for me because now there's two of me. But what I'm doing over here is I'm using the participants button and the chat button in order to see my students in the waiting room and send them messages that come up on their screen in the waiting room while I'm there. Now, with the messages that have been sent to them in the waiting room, they'll pop up as a little bit of a notification. I can just give them that kind of one-to-one reassurance that they are in the right place, there is a human being the other end. But ultimately, I've got complete control of when I let them in to my teaching environment, sort of the equivalent to asking your class to wait outside. And that's got a real advantage because it gives you a very, very clean start to your course, and it ensures that over the rest of your desktop you can have everything set up so that you are ready to go with all of your resources and you begin everything really promptly. We know that the students are in the waiting room, but what we haven't yet seen is just how that chat looks on their screens. So we'll have a look at that now. So on the iPhone, your screen real estate is somewhat limited. We've got the waiting room screen still displayed here, and eventually over my left-hand shoulder, when I send the message, a little chat box should pop up, and that little chat box will give the user, there it is, the opportunity to bring up the message. Once they've read the message, they'll go back to the waiting room. Further messages will enable them to click on it again, and then they can see what it is that's been sent. You'll notice that they don't have any right of reply here. Messages sent from the instructor to the waiting room are sent purely as a broadcast, so they're just an announcement, but it's quite clear that they've been sent by a human being, so it's quite reassuring for our delegates. Let's head over to the main computer screen and see how different it looks there. So on the Windows computer screen, there's much more screen real estate. We've got the waiting room up, but this time, when I send the message out via the chat, it actually has the space to occupy a different area. So over there on the far left-hand side, you can see the announcement that the meeting will start shortly, followed fairly rapidly by the further announcement that says that the delegate is in the right place. So we've met our students with the waiting room. They know that they've arrived somewhere. No human being has been involved in that, but the setup gives them some reassurance that they have indeed come to the right place. If you're there, if you are the other end, a little personal bulletin message coming through on the chat can be a really useful way to just provide a little bit of reassurance. They've also got the ability to test their audio, and if they know that this is something that's a good idea, they can test their camera and they can make sure that their sound settings are working, that they can hear what they should, and that their microphone is also working. So once we've done all that, once we've sort of hosted their way into the waiting room, what we've then got to do next is we've got to admit them to the meeting. So we're going to next head back over to the instructor screen and just show what that looks like when we pull them in to the meeting. Now, for this particular screen, I've got 2 delegates that I'm pulling in from the waiting room. You could have 2, 4, 6, up to the limit of what the Zoom will allow. And it's a really clean way to start the meeting because it brings them all in at the same time. We'll head over there now. Okay, so the mouse goes up to the Admit All button, and when I click that Admit All button, what I get is my screen goes small in this particular setting, and the other delegates then start to arrive in the meeting. They're all pulled in at the same time, takes them a few seconds, and because I've enabled the setting that all delegates are on mute when they enter the meeting, all of their microphones are showing up as muted. That's a really useful function, and it lets you have that nice clean start where you're the one that starts talking, get control of your students, and then you can go round for introductions a little bit later. So not much different to the face-to-face classroom there. We've had a nice welcome, a nice waiting room, but we've controlled when we've brought our students in. We've made sure that we've got our room set up, ready, everything good to go, and we've pulled our students into the meeting when we want to. So having brought our students into the meeting, into the virtual classroom, we then want to have a think about how we've set all of that up. Now, a lot of this online software is configured by default to put everybody in some sort of gallery view where you can see multiple different people all at the same time. It might even be set up so that whoever is talking comes up larger on everybody's screen and has the focus put on them. Now that works really, really well in a meeting environment where you want that sort of collaborative setup and situation. But when we set up our classroom in the real world, our traditional classroom, we normally orient things so that people are pointing almost completely or certainly substantively towards the presenter, towards the instructor. So we make sure all of their chairs are angled towards any resources that we can see and angled towards us so that they can hear our voice and they can pick up on what it is we're trying to tell them. We can do exactly the same thing in software like Zoom. We can make sure that the focus is on us and that our students aren't spending too much time, hopefully, looking at each other. So let's head over to the instructor screen and the sort of master Zoom control to look at how we might do that. So here we are, and we're back in the meeting. And if we have a look at my mouse, which is just up there in the top sort of right-hand corner of the screen as you're looking at it over the view button, I can change the view. I can change the view into gallery mode, and gallery mode's where it puts all of us side by side up to a maximum of about 24 per screen, depending on how big your screen is. I can also change that view mode to speaker, and speaker mode is where it will focus on whoever is speaking at any given time. Now, speaker mode might be considered sort of beneficial because as the instructor you will be spending most of your time speaking, but what it does mean is that if one of your students unmutes themselves, all of the focus gets put on them. They end up larger, taking over everybody's screen. So having a little look at the mouse again, the mouse is now moving over to the picture of me, which is top left. And on the picture of me, which is top left, clicks on the three buttons and then goes down to this control here, Spotlight for Everyone. So if you're having a look at the Spotlight for Everyone button, once I click that, what then happens to me is I get made larger, and all of a sudden you've got two of me again with my somewhat brutal lockdown haircut. So there's me large on my screen to show what I can expect that the students will see. And if we go and take a look at the student screens now, we can see how that changes for them. So what we've got over here is we've got the iPhone, which has the smaller screen, and the changing by the presenter of the mode that they're operating in to gallery or to speaker doesn't actually do anything for users the other end for your students. But if, for example, the presenter changes their mode to Spotlight, then it guarantees that the presenter, the instructor, will stay large and will stay in focus on the student's screen. The student can still change the screen modes themselves if they want to. So for example, they can change into gallery view, which is what's just happened here. They can go back into speaker view and that will change who shows up in larger sort of picture. But as soon as the instructor changes themselves to presenter view, they will take over the screen regardless. What we're going to do now is go over and have a look at how that looks on the larger screen. We are on the larger screen, and the learner, in this case Ivan, has the ability to click on the buttons on the presenter and pin them if they want to. But if they do nothing, if they change nothing, then ultimately what will happen is still just the same. When I put myself into presenter mode, there I am, spotlight on me, I take up the entire screen and the others get slightly smaller, so their focus is on me and any of the content that I'm sharing. So trying to emulate the traditional classroom in your setup and ensuring that your students have a focus on you as the instructor and the content that you are sharing is really, really important part of the virtual classroom training, giving you the ability to interact with them, enthuse them, and make sure that your teaching is on point with them. You don't want them having a window into each other's lives, looking at what each other's up to, coordinating some kind of weird wacky dance in front of you or anything like that. You want to make sure that your focus is on you, and that Spotlight for Everyone function is the best way you've got of doing that. Okay, So now what we want to do is start to really get into the likes of Zoom and similar software and have a little bit of a look at the interactivity features that they've got built in. So the first one that I want to start with is having a little bit of a look at the whiteboard and the whiteboard function. We'll all be familiar with using a whiteboard to write ideas up on, maybe have drawings, maybe have something pre-prepared in a traditional classroom. And the digital whiteboard gives us a number of sort of different features, a number of extra features, and has a number of drawbacks. So having a little bit of a look at a Zoom meeting here, apologies if my face lags a little bit while I'm doing this, what we've got is the native Zoom controls shown on the screen. So to share our whiteboard, we simply need to click the share screen button and go to the whiteboard functionality. When we then share the whiteboard, we get set up this nice whiteboard setting. Instead of just drawing in the same way as we might do with a pen on a normal whiteboard, it also gives us the opportunity to type text, which can really aid in the user readability if you're bad with handwriting or anything like that, as quite often I am. We can maintain relative eye contact with our students while we do it. This is both one of the benefits of the whiteboard and indeed one of the drawbacks at the same time, because it's actually very hard to type and talk simultaneously. So keep that in the back of your mind, because the whiteboard in itself is still a very useful way to marshal the thoughts from your students, and we can also use the similar annotation tools which have popped up in Zoom for further functions and further changes. So the next thing that we want to have a little bit of a look at is how that works for our student views and how we might be able to use this in different circumstances. When you enable the whiteboard for your students, if you're spotlighted, it replaces you on the screen, and the whiteboard then comes up nice and large. Anything that the instructor types, so this is me typing now viewed from a student's perspective, will then just come up as it's typed, as it's drawn, as it's shown. Something that you can also do is you can give your students the ability to annotate. So if you have a look at the mouse cursor, which is up towards the top right hand screen, when the delegate clicks View Options, they can then go down to the Annotate control. So the cursor's over the Annotate control now. When they then click on that, it will bring up, if enabled as a function, exactly the same toolbar that you might have had as an instructor on your screen on your Zoom. They can use exactly the same functions. They can type, they can put pre-existing ticks and cross stamps on things, really useful when you're marking or scoring a list. They can draw lines, squares, they can move things around. So something that's unique about using a virtual whiteboard is that if you do enable annotations and you let your students interact and write on your whiteboard and type and draw and do anything like that, they can only ever delete or manipulate anything that they themselves have done. So they can't take off anything that you've written up there. They can't take off anything that anybody else has written up there. As an instructor, you've then got the control of clearing everything that's on the screen, just what you've drawn on the screen, or just what they've drawn on the screen. And whilst we're looking at a whiteboard at the moment from a student perspective, it's important to remember that this could be anything that they could be drawing on. You don't have to share a whiteboard. What you can share, if you want to, for example, is you could share a picture, and you could get your students writing over the top of a picture, annotating a document, marking something, drawing onto a race course, whatever it is that you want to project up. You have got these tools to make it a two-way evolutionary process. And once you've produced anything, once you've got anything that's been kind of built by your students, it's very simple to save it as a single screen, or indeed, if you want to, it's very straightforward to have Zoom set up so it records your entire session, which you can later cut out and segment and replay later. So really powerful functionality, something that emulates something that we would do in a face-to-face physical classroom, but with some added twists that really help us to teach, interact and enthuse in the virtual classroom. So just having had a look at those first couple of views now and seeing things from both an instructor point of view and a student point of view, hopefully we can sort of tell that how things look on one screen might not necessarily be how they look on another. So always have a backup plan and ask your students what they can see. So we're about halfway through, and I'd like to remind you all that whilst this was pre-recorded, I am available live in the Q&A part of the session, so please do fire your questions at me. We will be publishing the Q&A a little bit later, so if you are watching this after the conference, don't worry, it might be that some of the questions will later be answered and later published. So when it comes to delivering training in the virtual classroom, something that is probably quite a big temptation is to produce a keynote presentation or a PowerPoint presentation or some Google Slides and share those directly from your computer with you talking over the top of them, bringing up new words and new interactions on the slides as you go through. But that probably wouldn't represent the very, very best that an RYA instructor can do. And when it comes to our students, being able to action map the words that they see on the screen or the pictures that they see on the screen with what it is that we're expecting them to be able to do either in training or in the real world might be a little bit of a challenge. So one of the best investments that you can make is to look at getting some sort of additional camera setup, some sort of second device, so that you can broadcast a little bit more that's going on live than just your face and maybe some slides or something shared directly off your desktop. This doesn't need to cost the earth. You can buy a low-cost webcam. You might have one already kicking around. You can use a mobile phone or a tablet as a second camera. Zoom, for example, will allow you to set them up as an additional delegate, or there are apps out there that are free for both Android and iOS that will let you set up your device as what's called a virtual camera, which will stream in as something that's an additional device. So it's not impossible, and often it can be done with kit that you've already got. The advantage that you've got of a second screen is that you can show exactly what the student is going to see. So let's have a little bit of a look at that. So here we are with our second screen set up. And this is a site that's probably familiar to most of you. This is just an additional camera that I've got pointing down in my study onto an RYA training chart. When you send students shore-based packs, for example, they will get paper charts in them. So this gives them the chance to see you working with the chart in exactly the way that you would expect them to. The use of a plotter is much, much clearer if you can visually demonstrate it in action, rather than trying to use animations or trying to use anything that the student won't have themselves. While you're working with a second camera, it's good not just for charts, but also for things like publications. If you're going to bring something up in an almanac, then better to have your students see you flicking through the pages and finding the right bit of information, or struggling with your handwriting and lining up the plotter on a tidal curve, then see you doing it using Wizzy Graphics on the eBooks app. Make sure that whatever you do is big, bold, and looks good for the students. Having a screen that shows you what it is your students are looking at can be really, really helpful. For example, if I share this model over here, the aspect doesn't readily allow you to tell what it is or give any of the defining characteristics that you would use to recognize it. Changing the profile instantly changes the picture. A light pencil mark on a chart might be best practice, using a soft pencil that is easily erasable, but wouldn't necessarily reflect to being transmitted on your second camera particularly well. I quite like these erasable marker pens called Frixion, and the advantage of using these is that when you do draw a line, it's big, it's bold, and it's picked up by the camera. So with all that in mind regarding second cameras, second screens, and sharing more to our students that can be readily action mapped to what they're doing, there is still a time and place for sharing something that does come through digitally. So within the Zoom functions, you can share an iPad or an iPhone via a cable, and bringing up and showing your students what an app looks like that they might use themselves in the real world, bringing up and showing your students the RYA ebook suite and working with interactive tidal curves or working with the information in the almanac is usually quite straightforward when it comes to marking questions that they've done, rather than showing them a process that they themselves must follow. So let's take this particular example of the RYA SafeTracks app and how that will look when we share it to our students. So for having a look at app sharing, we're going to go straight over to a student view and have a look at what they see when RYA SafeTracks is shared by the instructor. So when you start sharing an app, initially, if what you're sharing is your phone screen, then if the app isn't open, that is exactly what your students and delegates will see, whether it's a phone or a tablet. So having the app open in the beginning is advantageous. Once the app is then shared, however, it comes up and you can interact with it, select, push all the buttons, do everything, and know that everything that you do with it is transmitted straight to your students. That's really, really useful for any app, SafeTracks, weather forecasting, anything that you use live, a navigation app, all of that sort of stuff, to show them live what it's going to look like with movement, animation, and that sort of thing is a real bonus for you. We have to remember that with the three buzzwords that I've got, teach, well, we're teaching them for the real world. They're going to be using these apps day to day. They're going to be using all of these things on the water, so it helps to give them that hook to reality. Interact, it gives them something moving, it gives them something that we can use to ask questions and use to engage with them. And enthuse, if we start acting as the sort of modern instructor that embraces all of these different tools and gives them their pros and cons and pitfalls, we will enthuse them about their use of these devices in the real world. So when it comes to delivering interactive training to our students, they get quite a lot from the instructor, from what we say, from what we do, from what we show them, and how we mentor them and support them. Equally, they get an awful lot from their fellow students. Peer review, peer support, peer learning, peer working is really valuable. So we have the ability in a traditional classroom to ask people to work in pairs or work in groups, come up with ideas, complete exercises together, possibly even, if we've got a really nice sort of centre with multiple rooms, we could send them into different places, different spaces to spend time with each other. We can emulate that in the virtual classroom using a function called breakout rooms, and these can be predetermined. We can set them up in advance, or we can set them up on the fly, as it were, while we have our students within our session. So when it comes to setting them up on the fly in Zoom, let's head over to the instructor screen, have a little bit of a look with multiple delegates at how we go about putting them into breakout rooms, and then what that would actually look like for them before bringing it back to what that means for our buzzwords of teach, interact, and enthuse. Let's go and have a look. So in this particular example, I've only got 2 delegates, and I'm going to be going for the breakout rooms button, which is just down here. When I click on the breakout rooms button, it comes up with a dialog box which enables me to choose how many breakout rooms I want. I've chosen 1 breakout room, and the functions that it gives me allow me to specify who goes into which room, switch people around. I can actually rename the rooms, so if I've got a scenario that the students are going to do or something like that, I could call the room the name of the scenario. Once I've got all of my students allocated, they've seen nothing so far. I can then press the Open All Rooms button. When I press the Open All Rooms button, they then get a little warning that flashes up on their screen, which tells them that I've invited them to join a breakout room. When they select that, it will then take them into that unique room with just the people that I've selected. Whilst the students are in their breakout rooms, I'm then left in the main room with any of the students that I didn't put into any of the breakout spaces, or just on my own. So at that point, I can start to look at what content I want to get ready for the next bit of the session, what it is that I want my students to be doing next, writing notes, sipping my cup of tea, whatever it is that I want to do. If I want to communicate with my students, I can go back through the breakout rooms tab, and that little button down there, the broadcast message to all button, enables me to type something so that I can send them a little bit of a bulletin that lets them know what's happening. That will then pop up on the top of their screen in much the same way as it did while they were in the waiting room at the beginning. When I then decide that I want to close the breakout rooms, I've got this button, which allows me to close the breakout rooms, and it gives my students a 1 minute warning, 1 minute countdown to wrap up with everything that they were doing, and hopefully then come back to my main session out of their breakout rooms. Once they're back in my main session, they'll all be muted if I've selected that option to mute participants on entry, and I can go round, get the reviews, find out how the breakout rooms worked for them. I can't see them, I can't hear them while they're in the breakout rooms, but what I can do is I can at any point drop into any of the breakout rooms to go and see what they're up to on request, or if I just decide that I myself want to dive in and announce my presence and tell them that I'm there to see how they're all getting on. A very, very useful feature from a training point of view and a teaching point of view, rapid development of our students by getting them to do peer learning, and we can obviously interact with them in a different way, let them interact with each other, and it gives them something that gives them a break from our instructor's voice, so it helps them to feel enthused about everything that they're up to. When we're sharing video content to our students in the virtual classroom, it's not as straightforward as it might be in the traditional face-to-face classroom, where we have it maybe embedded into a presentation document, knowing that it will simply come up on the screen and we can push play, and that whatever speakers are plugged into our computer will broadcast the sound. We have to remember that the sound that our students are hearing comes from our microphone, and what they're seeing requires their computer to download it from the internet, process it, and represent it on screen. So we want to be avoiding using presentation software in the virtual classroom anyway, unless it's strictly essential, because it doesn't give us the best sort of method of communicating information and presenting assets to our students. When we're sending them a video, there's also a few technical aspects that we need to consider within the virtual classroom environment. So let's head over to the Zoom. And while we're in the Zoom here, what we've got is we've got the ability to share the screen. And when we click Share Screen, there's a number of different things that we can select. I've got my video down here on Teaching in the Classroom. That's the one that I want to select to share. And what I want to do is just tick these two options down the bottom. I want to share the sound. That means that the sound of the video, the sort of electronic sound that normally would be output by my computer's speakers, will be picked up and transmitted across the internet to my students in the virtual classroom. And then the second thing that I want to do is I want to optimize the screen sharing for the video clip so that it tries to be as full screen as possible as it can for my students. Once I've then share button, they will get the video on their screen, and as you can see on mine, what we've ended up with is we've ended up with the video bordered in green so that we know that that is the content that we're sharing. Videos can add an awful lot to our teaching. They're another way to interact with a student, and they can leave our students feeling slightly more enthusiastic, so we want to try and incorporate them wherever possible and wherever necessary. So when it comes to looking at the options to teach, interact with and enthuse our students, we can share anything that we can see, touch, move around using a second camera, using our main camera and holding it up to the screen. And we can share anything that we can represent electronically using the virtual classroom screen sharing options. And thinking about the things that we can plug in and the things that we can attach to our screens, really there is no limit. Most functionality or most software will give us the functionality to share a second screen, for example, from an iPad. So I've got my iPad over here redrawing with a chart app, so you can get your students to see it, interact with it, and engage with it live. You can even hand over control to them. If you want to get a little bit more advanced, here is the screen from a network-connected Raymarine chart plotter. Other plotters will support this sort of function where you can get real-time network streams shared. You can just record video footage when you're allowed out boating again to produce assets and produce resources. Having all of those things and having all of the things that the RYA has produced for us means that we can also share native apps such as the RYA eBooks app with all the functionality that gives us. So we can bring up, for example, if we're teaching a shore-based course, things like the Training Almanac, Knots handbooks, where we can show animations, we can show all of the kind of assets and pictures that the RYA have produced for us. And in general, if we can get it onto our computer screen, we can share it. If it's moving, if it's designed for our students, if it's got features for our students, then that's a huge benefit to us. So we should go ahead and use it. So our three buzzwords for delivering RYA training in the virtual classroom were teach, interact, and enthuse. So if we have a look at all of the tools and techniques that are available to us as instructors, we get quite a large list of different things that we can do, different ways that we can teach, enthuse, and interact with our students. And the list appears a little bit daunting at the moment if we're thinking about putting it into the virtual classroom, because it looks like we've got to learn a whole load of new skills and turn ourselves into IT and streaming experts. But actually, if you start to sort of pick out various bits and pieces on the list that's come up behind me, start to think that maybe actually some of them will work just as well in the traditional classroom as they do in the virtual classroom, and vice versa. And there's probably only very few that are unique to the face-to-face classroom or unique to the virtual classroom. So a quick sort of the list shows that if we're teaching in the traditional classroom, we can have eye contact, we can have non-verbal communication, we can have physical touch, but they're really, really hard, verging on impossible, to replicate in the virtual classroom. However, in the virtual classroom, we can have digital audience response systems, live screen annotations, screen sharing, chat boxes, and real-time feedback, which can be really, really hard for us to emulate in a physical, traditional, face-to-face classroom. So we've got some skills that are limited to one environment or the other, but by far and away the biggest list is the one in the middle, the crossover list: one-to-one feedback, interaction, breakout rooms, raising hands, whiteboards, voiceover, games and activities, content projection, and resources and models. These are all skills that the good RYA instructor already deploys while they're teaching students. And if they work just as well in the traditional face-to-face classroom, they'll work brilliantly in the virtual classroom. There's not actually a huge amount of new stuff that we have to learn. And even if we don't have the capacity to learn the new stuff, if we just do what we're already doing to a high level, that'll be absolutely fine. So bringing all of that back to a summary, if we're going to train our students, we have to keep in the back of our mind the RYA syllabus, the RYA resources, our existing resources, and any additional resources we require for virtual classroom delivery. Exams take a totally different format online because it is impossible to invigilate an exam in the virtual classroom effectively. We want to make sure that we give a nod to their pathways and progression and where our students are heading and what they're going to go and do later on in their boating careers. And we want to ensure that we keep their motivation towards engaging with RYA training up. When it comes to interaction, we know that interactivity aids learning, increases enjoyment, allows them to have a bit of that sort of missing at the moment networking and social interaction. They'll often talk to each other during tea breaks and that sort of thing in the virtual classroom. It enables us to monitor learning, and it shows that we're really adaptable. And the big one, we have to enthuse our students. Boating is fun. We've got to respect their lives on the lens. We've got to respect where they're going, engage with that contract of learning, and make sure that we ourselves are enthusiastic about this new method of delivery and bringing the best we can onto screen into the future. Thank you very much for listening. I'm around for the live Q&A until the session shuts down, and you can always send further questions straight through to the training department. Thank you.